Welcome to the 8th edition of the Eastern Himalayan Naturonomics Forum. My name is Kunal Majumder. I'm a journalist by profession and associated with the Impulse NGO Network's Model Press Lab. Impulse Model Press Lab supports and mentors journalists who report on human trafficking issues. In this session, we are going to talk about the link between ecological depredation and human trafficking and how sustainable livelihood can help mitigate these two challenges. This conversation has become even more important now during the ongoing global pandemic because we are witnessing an unprecedented crisis in the economy and workforce. While on one hand, we have seen thousands of workers returning to their villages at the outbreak of the pandemic and being left with no or minimum income, on the other hand, reports suggest that the pandemic has led to new forms of human trafficking and exploitation of the vulnerable sections of the society. We have three experts with us today to take this conversation ahead. Mr. Saurav Malhotra is the co-founder and designer of Balipara Foundation's Rural Futures Framework. Ms. Hasina Karbhih is the founder of Impulse NGO Network and Impulse Social Enterprises. And both of them join us from India. And from Nepal, we have Dr. Govind Prasad Thapa. Dr. Thapa is former Additional Inspector General of Nepal Police and Impulse Model Nepal Policy Advisor and a trainer on the Nepalese legal framework. Let's begin with Saurav. Saurav, the theme of this year's forum is Ecology is Economy. What role does the economy play to mitigate the twin evils of environmental depredation and human trafficking?
Thanks a lot, Kunal. So I think I'll just start to give an overview of sort of how ecology can begin to come back into the economy, and then try to see how we can sort of work through a green economy sort of perspective. So if you look at the world, right, I mean, there's about 7 billion people in the world. About half of these people live in rural areas, but about 97% of the wealth of the world is located in urban hotspots. About 1.5 billion people directly depend on forests for all their livelihood problems. And this is not a problem at all. The remaining 5.5 billion people in the world indirectly depend on forests still for their livelihoods, not only forests, but also rural areas. And they depend on natural resources for all essentials, including food, building material, water, and technically including for the air that you breathe. And the problem that we're having is that this unsustainable and carbon-driven and over-extractive use of our forests and other natural resources to drive standards of living is really where the problem is today. So the problem has never been in rural and of rural use of the forest, but the problem has come with the over-extractive needs of the urban hotspots. Which is why I think bringing what we try to do through the Rural Futures Framework is to bring wealth back to the forests. And the reason why I'm saying back is because long before the dawn of agriculture, like about 7,000 years ago, some of the greatest forests of the world, including the Amazon rainforest, was actually a large farm for the indigenous people. And there are many reports that actually prove that the biodiversity of the Amazon basin has actually been enhanced by indigenous people growing food within the rainforest, right? So there is enough evidence to prove that humans have actually helped increase biodiversity, contrary to the way we think about it today, because now we see humans as being, derogatory for forest growth, for any kind of natural resources, but that is not the case, and that does not have to be the case. And the case here is not just of biodiversity conservation, but also trying to use the forests to bring further equity and to bring social justice in this whole process of bringing wealth back. And some of the trends that we've seen, and some of the very interesting trends actually in Nepal, have been that Nepal is one of the few countries in Asia where the forest cover has actually gone up in the last 3 decades. And the reason attributed to this forest cover rising has actually been the outmigration of people, right? But this outmigration of people is usually unclassified, very rarely documented, and very rarely for actual authentic jobs outside of Nepal. So the gathering here and a lot of the discussions that have been happening between Rural Futures and Impulse is that a lot of this migration anyway happens because people lack basic livelihoods. And that people are usually on the front lines of climate change, lack basic livelihoods, and therefore are forced to migrate out of their rural pockets. In countries like India and Nepal, where a huge chunk of the population is rural, in Nepal, almost 80% of the population is rural, this outmigration from rural areas leaves lands fallow, and therefore nature gets back. But is this really a good way for us to reforest our futures? I don't think so. So through the Rural Futures Framework and by bringing ecology back into the economy, what we are saying is that indigenous communities, especially youth, can get involved in the complete value chain of rewilding a forest. And this value chain of rewilding a forest creates jobs immediately, creates medium-term income generation, and creates long-term income security. And by creating these kinds of jobs, we are not only preventing unsafe migration, but actually giving people aspirational livelihoods while still remaining in rural areas, and thereby creating rural futures. Right? Thanks.
Thank you, Saurav. Hasina, you started Impulse NGO Network, I think 30 years ago, and you've extensively documented and did advocacy on human trafficking issues. Can you explain to our audiences from your own experience where you've seen a link between unsafe migration and human trafficking with ecology? I mean, I immediately can think of the Jantia Hills where mining led to a lot of human trafficking. If you could expand on that.
Thank you, Kunal. I mean, I would just say that taking back from the mining, the rat hole mining in Meghalaya, and looking it from the context that almost 60% of children who are working in the rat hole are from Nepal. So we saw a huge migration, which was unsafe and also exploitative in nature and linked to the environment, which is the destination point happened to be Meghalaya. So that is one trend that continued for almost 10 to 15 years, although the coal mining in Meghalaya has been running for 30 years, till the time that we started the campaign, the research and advocacy, and took forward to file a public interest litigation that led to the closure of the mine in 2014. So that itself was an evident trend of migration that is linked to the environment between India and Nepal. So we saw a huge chunk of manpower migrating unsafely into an exploitative situation in the state of Meghalaya, interlinked to human trafficking because it's labor trafficking. The other aspect that I want to bring forward is looking at the chicken neck of Indo-Nepal, which happens to be the, I would say, the entry point to Southeast Asia. Looking at 2 years now, we see a huge migration happening to Southeast Asia and the Middle East through the Northeast, which is Manipur, and also Mizoram, to Myanmar, and Myanmar to Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East. So we are seeing this trend of migration taking place, evidently because of the fact that we have been responding through our model, through the response of a government-to-government intervention between the three countries, and leading to a huge number of rescue of people going without any kind of legal document and putting their life at risk through this migration. Now, if you link to what Saurav has mentioned about the ecology, we realize that these people have land in their own country, they have their own resources, because when we had done a lot of repatriation back, a lot of the families and the children, when we visited many of the places like Dharan and Itahari and all these places, they had land, they had their entire economic livelihood that they could actually be involved, but they are not. So we are seeing that entire trend that if we start reworking on engaging that they stay back home and have an economy which is thriving, that would lead to preventing unsafe migration. So that is where this whole co-creation of the Impulse model and Rural Futures of Balipara Foundation emerge. How can we bring forward the interlink of livelihood initiative to prevent unsafe migration, taking into the example, real life example of the numbers of children that was actually trafficked for labor to Meghalaya coal mining, and also looking at the 2-3 years data. I mean, the number of women and men going to Southeast Asia and then Middle East, where Impulse work very closely with all the three governments to rescue and bring them back and send them back to Nepal. So these are very much interlinked. And we see that not that they don't have the resources, they have so much of resources back home, they have the land, they have, it could be built up. So how can this be a way forward to prevent unsafe migration, giving them local economy by choice? So that is where the whole framework works, Kunal.
Okay. Dr. Thapa, given your broad and high-level understanding of the development pressures in Nepal, how have you seen through over 3 decades of your experience a change in forested areas, indigenous livelihood, social mobility, and unsafe migration?
Okay, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to join and talk to you about the ecology and the problem that arises out of the environment degradation. And I congratulate, I must say, I must compliment Balipara Foundation for starting a new connection on the topic of traffic in person, TIP. Well, as we all know that women and children are vulnerable to many types of crimes and violence in our societies, including Indian societies or Nepalese societies. So very much similar. Talking about the interlink between the human trafficking and the ecology is very much understandable. We can understand why, what happens when there is a drought. We understand what happens when there is a sudden disaster, natural disaster like earthquake or landslides or river floods and all that. Now, people have to migrate in two conditions. In Nepal, we experience people are migrating from their homeland in two situations. Number one is a slow degradation of the soil and a slow degradation of the environment, which is affecting the cultivation of crops, land of people. And they are looking out for new opportunities of their villages. So take for example, my own from Gulmi. Problem with my village is still is there is no good source of drinking water. So we depend mostly on a rivulet which flows quite far away from the village. So we have to manage the water through canals, kulo, we say kulo, rivulet type. So, but the problem now is that even the source of water is not sufficient. The village people are facing problem with the water. So most of the people, I myself have migrated from that village to Kathmandu. That's a problem. The other problem is about the sudden disasters and all that. We all know that in 2015, Nepal had a big disaster, earthquake, and the result was that many families were displaced from their villages from their hometown. We understand that a family moves from places which are very much risky in all conditions. They don't get a good shelter on the way to some destination. They don't get food. They don't get medicines. That becomes a problem for the family while displaced from their homeland or migrate or in the process of migration. So I think in our country, in Nepal, also, as you mentioned earlier, that we are also facing the acute problem of environmental degradation, environment problem. Sometime, I was going through the literatures that the people living in Mahakali areas, Rukum, Prolpa, in the outskirts, regions of, hilly regions, they don't have water, not only for the crops, but also for drinking water, no problem. Okay. So the acute problem of water and make many families to decide to go outside, to migrate and settle down somewhere else. So in that case, when they try to go out and settle in some unknown places, the risk of trafficking automatically, usually increase. We have seen it. During the 2015 earthquake, it was reported that many were those who became, orphan because their parents were lost, dead, only lonely, all of themselves. In that condition, unless government to intervene and protect the population, those who have been displaced from such, such places, so it becomes quite very, very difficult for the victims of the disasters to protect their children or protect themselves also. There are lots of problems, not only trafficking problems, but there are other problems of livelihoods and all that. So I think this is about. I would like to stress on the role of government. As we know that when the government is very much aware of it, when the government is very much sincere to look after the victims of such droughts or disasters on environment, problem is less. Then if the government is not aware or not sensible or not working, not planning, then the problem increases. The Balipara Foundation is trying to, as I understand that you have through your literature, that you're trying to educate people at the grassroots. That's very good. I have been always saying that, to address the problem at the local problem, we must engage the local community. The policy systems. At national level, we have National Assembly, district levels, and then down at the ward level, we have ward people and all that. But we don't have the communities involved in the local politics. We cast our votes to a political party, the member of a political party. Govind Thapa Now he is the candidate of Nepali Congress or, Maoist party. No, you vote for the party, not the people, not the community. Now, my judgment is that unless we involve the community to address the local problems, the problem will remain there for a long time. Take, for example, being a police officer, my experience of community policing is could be useful. When we say that community policing means working with the community to control the crime and rather to investigate the crime also, and a lot of other things to maintain the security and safety in the society. But when we actually, materialize, try to actually, enforce this idea in the society or in the community, what we do is, that's our mistake that we have been doing. What we do is we take some police person from local, not from the local area, but from Uttara area. Say, for example, Mr. Yadav is taken to Rukum Rolpa, the hilly regions. And so as soon as the police living in a different culture goes to on duty in different place with different culture, then the conflict starts at the very first stage. So we should recruit the police from the local people, local community, and we should depute them to work in their locality with the community, so that will enhance the source of information and communication will be better with the state mechanism.
Okay.
That it exactly fits with the environment maintenance. If we engage the local people in the war, in this work of retaining environment intact, we must involve the local people.
That's a very good point by Dr. Thapa. I would really like both Hasina and Saurav to come in. If you could share with us examples of engaging with the local community. I mean, Hasina from the perspective of social enterprise, and Saurav perhaps from the perspective of environmental sustainability. Perhaps Hasina first.
So I think taking from what Dr. Govind has mentioned, we look at migration because of not having all the accessibility that every human being would require for a natural living at their environment, where there was crops and water, living conditions, and that's how migration is a push factor. And that's how it's also lead to unsafe migration. But if we are going back to building local economies and taking it the context that how people can flourish at the local economy, work with the government through what Dr. Govind has been mentioning, is that we had applied impulse social enterprises as a way of addressing unsafe migration by capitalizing local traditional skill, especially taking handloom and handicraft as an entry point, because that's the richness of a lot of indigenous population, across India, across Eastern Himalayan. And we had done that with the 8 states of the Northeast and have seen that that is also one way of giving choices to indigenous population to prevent them from unsafe migration and building in local economy, because this is a resilience market that we created. Because resilience market is also very important, crucial for people to have choices. Because by and large, I think looking at the way we are geographically in the Eastern Himalayan, we have China on the other end, where we have a lot of products coming into our region, whether it's Nepal or the northeast of India for that matter, or even Myanmar, that where we are working, and even Bangladesh, we see that people are consuming more product which is cheaper and and is easily produced. And here we're going back by building local economy, preserving traditional skill, traditional cultural identity, and providing market access so that the local economy can thrive. Women will have choices not to migrate. And that's how Impulse Social Enterprises was born. But if you're looking at the inbound migration that has happened during the lockdown and the COVID, we see that the massive population that are coming back would require more economic support at the ground. And that would be looking at what is available. And I think that's where I think Saurav can add in what the whole ecology and economic can actually supplement and support in co-creating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would also like to take from something that Dr. Thapa emphasized on quite a few times, is that the reason for out-migration, whether from rural Nepal to urban Nepal, or whether from rural Nepal to outside the country, has always been the lack of basic assets, whether it is water or education or healthcare. So the lack of basic assets seems to be the worldwide common denominator for the reason why people migrate, right? So we've in fact been trying to tackle that through the environmental lens. And I think that COVID-19 has brought in a fascinating light to this as well. So I'll just make those connections and tell you about how actually indigenous communities have to lead this whole process. So I think COVID-19 has brought a lot of attention into the benefits of rural and local economies. And Hasina mentioned about the benefits of local economies as well. And what we've seen, what has been highlighted across the course of our work as well, and I know that the work of Impulse, is that local economies are inherently resilient, right? They are resilient to disruptions in global supply chains. In fact, local economies in many of the places where we work in Assam continued to function irrespective of national lockdowns, because everything that we grew was to be consumed locally, and everything was grown with the perspective that it wouldn't have to travel for more than 5 kilometers from the place of growth. So I think local economy planning is really important, and I think through the rural framework we're trying to establish just this, not only involving rural and indigenous communities in the value chain of rewilding, like I mentioned earlier, from collecting seeds to maintaining nurseries to planting trees, but also creating added livelihood incentives through agroforestry, for example. And these livelihood incentives basically keep you going till the forest is ready for harvest, which can take anything from 10 years to 30 years. But what has been essential to the success of any of these programs is to drive communities to own and to autonomously run the programs. So every Rural Futures program is sort of built with an idea that we must exit from location A in 5 years or in 6 years or in 7 years based on the needs of the area. And that in this particular point in time, we must ensure to build community organizations if they don't exist already. If they exist already, help enhance community organizations and community skills to run the whole framework far beyond me or any of us, and also replicate the framework. So what has been key to success is to get indigenous youth involved in programs. I think what we've seen is that indigenous youth have actually served as ambassadors for the programs in many cases. And indigenous youth-led organizations have been the organizations that have been able through challenges, suffer through programmatic challenges, through weather challenges, through economic downturns. And now that in COVID-19, many people actually come back from, say, Bangalore or Kerala or wherever it is that they were working, the opportunity today to create rural, local green economies is great. So it is a fantastic opportunity to actually keep people back where they belong, and to keep them engaged in ways that are not frontline, borderline, or basic, but actually ways in which they tend to the land that they own anyway, right? And create livelihoods that are aspirational, and create livelihoods for which they moved out of that place in the first place. You know what I mean? So I think it's really about driving community autonomy. And I know that, I mean, community autonomy is a very sensitive topic. I mean, governments and communities and all of that. But I think the ultimate vision for conservation in the world, and it is a proven fact that any land, any forest that is owned by communities, that is managed by communities, this is across Brazil and El Salvador and Colombia, Indonesia, that community-owned lands are already conserved, right? And the kind of deforestation that you see on community-owned and community-managed lands is nothing as compared to what you see in either privately owned lands or in publicly government sort of owned lands. So the real, I think, vision for global conservation, South Asian conservation especially, because this is where we have a lot of deforestation at this point in time, is to get power back to the communities. And I think that Nepal has made fantastic strides because they actually gave out about 18% of their land to communities to own and manage and run in about the 70s. And that is also what actually created a dramatic shift in reforestation trends in Nepal. You know, so we must be able to build community institutions to run these things. And there is no better time than now. There is absolutely no better time than now.
Dr. Thapa, if you could also share your perspective of what happened after the pandemic, because I believe Nepal does have a major percentage of workforce who were working outside the country, particularly in India. And with pandemic, we saw a reverse migration, a lot of workforce, at least in India, who were going back. And then borders were sealed. And I lived in Himachal Pradesh, where I know that during the apple plucking season, a lot of Nepalese laborers, they come to work here. But this year, because the borders were sealed, they didn't come. How has the situation been in Nepal internally with the borders sealed? How are these laborers, workforce managing to survive? And are you observing any kind of positive or negative development in such a situation?
Okay. In terms of this COVID epidemic situation, people of Nepal, both countries, people of Nepal and the people of India, Indian people who those in Nepal and Nepalese people, those who were working in India, wanted to come back to their country, return to their country. They had problems at the borders. The problem with the there was no enough or effective medical services were not enough, not effective in both and at the borders. So many persons were held up at the borders for several days, and they have survived at their own without proper management, without safety, without food, water, without not good, we can say the shelter homes or the quarantine type of establishment. No, they had a problem, and they came back to their house, to their hometown, to their villages. They returned anyhow, and for a couple of months, their family. But they had to go back to the Indian states once again, despite of the threats, despite the risk of pandemic way and on to the destination also. They had no choice. They had to leave because they had no alternatives. They had no livelihoods in their own village. The money that they had earned while working in India or in Nepal, it was all finished. So they had no alternative but to return to the India for job. That's a problem. So looking at environment, tying up this environment and this migration is a worldwide problem, as you said earlier. It's a worldwide. We have to work hard for this. The government has to take up this environment and migration or safe migration. There should be measures taken in a well-mannered, well-planned way. It's not here. The migration and this environment is often or most likely not discussed at the highest level of government level. At the policy level, it is just okay. It's not a very serious matter for the policymakers or for the rulers, or those who are in the government. So it should be picked up, or it should be taken up as a very serious matter, because the environment degradation, the environment problem has a long effect. It is just beginning to realize. We are just realizing that environment protection is essential, is very important. We are just beginning to realize. There are more, tragedies to follow in future, and it will be more difficult to manage. Nepal is not doing well in the front of managing pandemic as well as managing the environment. And also, I regret to say that the issue of this human trafficking is also rampantly, rampantly. It's not well organized way of handling the problem. Hasina tried to educate, and she tried to involve the Ministry of Women and Children while she was here. And we had an opportunity to talk to the people of the Ministry of Home about how we can work together and how we could, control in a collaborative way. But once we gave the, talked about the issue with some officials, then the officials were all transferred to some other places, and there was no, retention. There is no, kind of, a system which prevails even after an official is transferred from one place to another. This is a problem. I don't think, I don't know about the Indian this bureaucracy, but in Nepal we are having a problem with this thing. So I would say that environment, it's you raised about this. There is a problem of environment causing the loss of livelihood, and the loss of livelihood is further, a risk to the women and children, not only to the women and children, but also to the men also, because they have to leave the house, home, place, and wander in some other land without proper, salary, without proper medical treatments and all that. So many things are there.
Thank you, Dr. Thapa. Hasina, before we move to the last segment, where I would really like you guys to share some positive examples, I'd like to talk to you specifically about another side of the impact of the pandemic in terms of human trafficking. I mean, with the increased use of internet and phone, you and I have been talking about this previously as well. Could you throw some light on how pandemic is directly leading to new trends when it comes to human trafficking?
So we're looking at the data, I mean, for the last 8 months to 9 months, we have like 60% use of pornographic site increase in India. And that is alarmingly pushing a lot of younger children as well as women into the online unsafe situation, because the loss of job, the loss of employment is also making more women more vulnerable, and the increased rise of how we have seen the demand, of porn sites as well as exploitation online. And if you're looking at the dark web analysis that we've been doing with a team at a global level, we are seeing that there's a push factor to trafficking, which will be a lot of online. The huge transaction that is going online, looking at the kind of money transaction, because people are unable to get out. Most of the red light area are shrinking. There are more home-based kind of exploitation that is taking place. So that is a new trend of trafficking, and it also linked back to what I think Dr. Govind was mentioning on how governments will really need to really work together at a G2G level. And I think having said that, we have the similar trend in all the Eastern Himalayan countries, because the shifting of officers from one post to the next post is so, it happens so quickly in a span of 1 year. So this consistency of intervention becomes very, very challenging. And if you're looking at online safety issues, it's becoming an issue which will need to be dealt very intelligently. It will need more collaborative efforts. And at the same time, countries like Nepal and others, where you have international company, setting up a lot of their businesses, is opening up also to this kind of online, safety issues. So we have seen that trend that is taking place, and India is really, going to a high level of almost 60%, and coming with other countries on the edge of how these pornographic site exploitation online and unsafe exploitation opening to young people sitting at home. So these are the kind of trends that is taking place in the last 8 to 9 months. It is not new, Kunal, but it has been there, but it increased huge, and it's amazing to see that.
Yeah, another factor, of course, I think, apart from the labor force returning and being unemployed, is also the increasing number of students who are now sitting at home, and young students, adolescent students who they don't have school to go back to. And if you remember, especially when Impulse did that whole report on Jantia Hills in Meghalaya, a lot of them were kids who had dropped out of schools and had gone out looking for jobs. So that, I think that's another section of the demography which is really vulnerable in absence of having regular engagement at the school level.
Yeah, that is looking at that. So I think education along with economic at the source is an important element, but without economic, education becomes very difficult, because many families are unable to send the children back to school, and it has to be a process which is holistic in nature. And having seen that, the lack of economic is pushing a lot of family not to send the children to school. And that's where our studies in the past, as well as the ongoing process of how we are actually looking at trends, the dynamic of trends, if the border is not sealed, we'll still see that people are being pushed to India, at the destination, and the illegal mining that continue to happen, because nobody's going to go into a scientific mining. So that trend is evidently very, very, opened, and everybody is seeing that. And the trend that we are studying right now is that how do we really prevent that? So preventing that would means providing economic livelihood at the source. And economic livelihood at the source cannot just be one-sided affair in terms of just one component of economic, but it has to be more of food security and others that will actually enhance the living condition of people. And then that leads again to climate change, the whole aspect of what we are trying to see. And I think maybe Saurav, you can add more on that, on how do we see mitigating that would help to prevent unsafe migration.
Yeah. So Saurav, of course, how this whole thing helps to mitigate the unsafe migration, but also in the last segment, I really like some positive examples, because, whenever we talk about environment and human trafficking, it's really depressing. And then we go back sad, but there is a solution possible. And that's where people like Balipara Foundation and Impulse, they come in, because they're not just saying it's just gloom and doom. There are ways out. So if you could share with some positive examples or steps that have been taken, and you think there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Sure, sure. I mean, Kunal, I completely agree that, I think doom stories do not work in the conservation world, so to inspire people, you have to tell them that good things are possible through examples, right? So I think like I would first like to emphasize on what Hasina was talking about in terms of economic drivers. I think so. The root of the rural futures model was what we figured really early on is that if you cannot incentivize conservation, if you cannot incentivize growing a new forest, then conservation cannot work in areas where people are not economically mobile and not socially mobile. Therefore, so the most critical sort of elements of the framework is that at every step of community involvement with the rural futures framework, there is economic incentivization of collecting seeds, of planting trees, of harvesting, etc., even till the point that you become dependent solely on your land and say completely independent of the program. And economic incentivization of conservation is really important in South Asia because most people who are involved in this kind of work do not have lack of basic assets. And that's the point which Dr. Thapa emphasized on a lot. And he emphasized on the fact that the lack of basic assets like water was some of the primary drivers for out migration. So through the model, by giving people economic mobility, we are actually creating this pool of natural capital. So natural capital is nothing but the wealth of your forest or the wealth of your land and the wealth of your rivers. Not a lot of it can be quantified, but some of it can be quantified and has been quantified by us. And the way Rural Futures sort of talks about community management is that communities owning land are actually managing the natural assets on them, right? And therefore, if your land gives you $100,000 a year, then this $100,000 belongs to your community, right? And then you as a community autonomously but also democratically decide what you want to do with this pool of money, right? You as a community believe that water access is a big problem, therefore you give yourself access to water. You believe that energy access is a big problem, therefore you give yourself access to energy. So we are not trying to tell people how to live life, but we are trying to create a pathway by which people will not only be conscious, but also mobile and be able to take decisions to govern their natural assets and to make the most out of these natural assets. So that's part A. So emphasizing on what Hasina had said. And I think talking about happy stories, Kunal, I think there are many. I think what has been very, very inspiring for us during COVID, I mean, the whole world was shut and all of that happened. I lived most of that time in the forest. So we did spend a bit of time on Zoom, Hasina, but I was in the forest. And I think what was really happening then, sort of like in the months of April and May, right? I mean, we saw a huge burst of people coming back to our project site. So if we would typically employ, say, 100 people per project site, say last year, this year there were about 300 people wanting work, right? And these 300 people wanting work were not more than 30 years of age. So most of these people were, say, between 18 and 25. A few were above the age of 25, and all were looking for employment, right? So the opportunity that we had then is that because finding young people to work on programs like this in rural Assam is tough, because all young people of rural Assam go and look for whatever menial jobs in Bangalore or Bombay, where they spend 70% of the money on rent, they send 20% of the money back home, and they are left with 10% of the money, right? Even if that is not unsafe migration, I don't think it is appropriate or aspirational migration. People do it out of desperation, right? People were back in Assam, people were seeing what their peers were doing together with the Rural Futures, the progress that their villages had made in the 4 years of the program, right? And the fact that there were, I wouldn't say that we had jobs for everyone. We did not. I mean, we are still trying to figure out how we can create jobs for all of these people who are back. But the aspirational values for which people had left the villages have now changed, because they have seen their peers involved in work, their peers equipped with technology, equipped with the skills, but also have their peers who have decision-making abilities now in communities, including the women, right? So a lot of the women who are also working outside, who are back now, are actually beginning to see that the women now have a voice, right? So like I was mentioning earlier, I think youth have been the ambassadors. So youth who've been a part of our programs for 4 years have now been the ambassadors for all the new youth who are back, right? So we are just trying to figure out how to keep all of these 300 people back, and by creating green employment systems. But I think some of the biggest success stories have been that 3 of the youth groups that we work with now have registered organizations of their own. And therefore, we are actually, thinking of exiting 3 years before plan, because they will be able to take the program on. And I think that the success of any conservation program is if the program goes beyond me or you or any organization, right? And that is happening. And one of these youth groups, through natural capital, has enough money now to rebuild a school, right? And rebuilding a school was a problem that the community thought was appropriate to solve now. And the fact that all of these decisions are being made at a community level, and by using sort of indigenous democracy. I wouldn't say that women representation is ideal yet. It's not. It is far from ideal, but it is growing. So I think that things can be done. I think that we just have to empower communities. I don't believe that we have to teach communities or raise awareness. I think they know much more than us sitting in urban areas. But I think that the whole point is to empower and to empower and to then work on policies to ensure that this empowerment has an outcome.
Thank you, Saurav. Dr. Thapa, lastly, before I come to Hasina for the last word, can you share some positive, do you see light at the end of the tunnel in Nepal when it comes to the issue of human trafficking and environmental degradation? Saurav already shared a positive story from the 70s when Nepal saw a lot of return of the green, but are things good? Are things going to change?
I don't have much to say about good sides, because I have not been in the field to see what's happening, in latest. But yeah, the people of Nepal are very much conscious about the degradation of the environment, and they are putting pressure vocally in writing to the government of Nepal to look into the matter very, very seriously. That is a positive aspect of the people's thought, people's initiative to improve the situation of environment in the country. This will not only help in Nepal or Nepalese people, but also the surrounding area, like Sikkim, Bhutan, India, and all that. It's not an effort for only Nepalese or Nepal, but it would be an effort for the whole humankind, human beings, or the society at large. So there are some couple of things coming up in Nepal, but the government is very much reluctant, and they are nowadays, I must say that they are engaged in their party politics only, and they have not been able to concentrate on the far-reaching programs that are actually necessary for the improvement of health and economy, and to control the crimes and violence that are frequently being happening in most of the areas. So I trust the people of Nepal that they are putting more and more efforts through media, through social media, and through the forums like you are organizing this thing. So we are putting more and more trust to improve the situation of environment, to improve the situation of economy, to remove the poverty, and also to control the trafficking and all sorts of other injustice prevalent in the society. Let's hope we can work together, maybe, and Indian people are also very much putting pressure to the government. I know, I can read in the newspapers and the media, we can see that. That's a very good system. And I would like to stress again, as our friend said, that the community and empowering community will be the best way to national development. Let's start from the first step. The first step I consider is the community, the family. So we should aware the family, we should aware the school, where the primary children are given primary education. The family, we should make aware our family members so that they are aware of the possibilities of being ruined or being cheated or being trafficked or being violated in our society, in our respective, in our communities. So actually we have to move to the community, local community. We must engage them in local politics also. They can conserve, they can protect, they can preserve the environment most effectively.
Thank you, Dr. Thapa.
That's what I believe.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a very interesting point, much like the COVID pandemic, environmental issues and perhaps even human trafficking is not restricted by national borders. So what's happening is happening across the region, Nepal, India, Bhutan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, the entire region. Hasina, last word to you. I would really like, there's a very interesting point both Saurav and Dr. Thapa pointed out in terms of community and youth. In Northeast India, which had seen a huge migration even before the pandemic outward, is seeing a reverse migration, so to speak, because we're seeing a lot of young people returning. During my last visit to Imphal, Manipur, I found a friend of mine. I was really surprised to find that he used to be a fashion designer in Delhi and has returned back to Imphal and has started his own boutique. So we are finding a lot of young people returning to Northeast and to Eastern Himalayas. And these are the people who are more aware about issues like human trafficking and environmental depredation. So could you throw some light in terms of what kind of changes you're noticing and observing, especially from the perspective of young people?
Taking forward, I think the way we have worked over the last 25 years is actually preventing unsafe migration by building and strengthening local economy, where we focuses very much with Impulse Empower, where we are trying to build, value chain end to end. In the process of building value chain end to end, where we work very much with women, and we were also trying to strengthen young people, especially to take interest what has been passed on from generation after generation. That is the weave and the craft and the textile, where we have managed to build a consistent market over the last 13 years. Having seen that, we have seen that young people were not very much interested then, but over the last 13 years, we have seen a trend where they have tried to value what the mothers are doing. And then we're having this whole gender equity, where all gendered participation are taking place in enhancing the way economic was being strengthened. And that was a positive trend in the sense that if we do an end-to-end, then you give choices, you build positive economy, and you also trying to mitigate climate change and other issues like human trafficking, which going to go a long way when we talk about preventing sexual exploitation and labor. Then we look at the last 8-9 months. It's interesting because our artisans has been the pillar of strength, because the weave continued, they were weaving from home, the whole processes of work continued, it did not stop. While the inbound migration, whether it's young youth and young population, all strata of work, they were returning back, they saw the value on what we were doing. So seeing that value, it's a positive trend because our master artisan would come back to us and say, oh, we need to expand the work we are doing. We need to build in more local economies in the weaving and also in the craft sector. And that's how I think COVID-19 has brought the co-creation, strengthening of co-creation, how ecology and economy can actually be woven with unsafe migration, and hand in hand positively can actually multiply. So scaling deep has been one of the way we had done over the years. And we had scaled out very much because that's what the Eastern Himalayan belt would mean. So, trying to prevent unsafe migration, addressing human trafficking cannot be looked from one lens, and scaling up is where people like Dr. Govind and all comes together in trying to create policy change, because along with policy change, then you strengthen local economy end to end. If you're talking about sustainable fashion or sustainable textile, if you don't actually have an end-to-end value chain being created, then you're just doing an economic which is not complete. It's actually just one tip in the iceberg. So that's not the way we look. But positively, this is going to enhance, but then we'll need also, scaling up, because we need deeper policy. And I think India and Nepal will need to also look at these policy engagement, because at the end of the day, we have manpower from Nepal into India. But if we strengthen the economies of both ends, they would have more of an exchange of strength rather of what we call it unsafe migration or exploitation that can happen to human being. So that's the positive way that we're looking at it, Kunal.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this important conversation. Through our expert panelists, we've tried to offer a win-win situation for all stakeholders, even in developed countries like US. Remember, US President-elect Joe Biden has also been talking about green jobs and how green jobs can help transform America and do away with unemployment there. So in a country like ours, where we already have an economy at rural area, which can be sustained and which can be evolved further to help both in terms of ecological sustainability, as well as in terms of stopping unsafe migration and human trafficking. This is certainly a win-win solution for everyone. Remember, we only have one Earth, and let's try to protect it while we all survive. We all survive. That's all I can say. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching.